the presidency. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has formally requested the National Assembly's approval of a $21.5 billion external loan and a 758 billion naira pension bond. This request, submitted through multiple letters to the Senate and the House of Representatives, aims to fund critical infrastructure projects and clear outstanding pension liabilities.
Now, according to the President's proposal, the loan will be directed towards transportation, healthcare, and other priority sectors. But this financial move has raised several questions and concerns as to why Nigeria needs another massive loan, especially when the country had just recently cleared its IMF loan, and how would this impact our already strained economy? Now, join us this morning for this discussion is the partner and head of research at SBM Intelligence, Ikemesit Effiong. Warm welcome to you, Mr. Effiong, and thanks for joining us on Breakfast Central.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Now, as we speak this morning of the 28th of May 2025, Nigeria's public debt stock already exceeds 87 trillion naira. Will this new loan stimulate development, or would we be in the debt trap of endless cycle of borrowing? Do we need it at this time, basically?
Well, I mean, Nigeria is something of a precarious chicken and egg situation when it comes to its public finances. On the one hand, right, public debt, the total stock, right, of the country's debt, as you said, right, has increased dramatically, right. So we're in a situation now, like you said, where we have 87 trillion naira. For context, when we returned back to democratic rule in 1999, our total debt stock, which we needed, if you remember, Paris Club and we need in order to overcome, was 3.5, the equivalent of 3.5 trillion naira in today's naira, right? So we have a situation where our debt has increased more than 1,000%, the total stock, right, in 25 years. On the other hand, Nigeria is dealing with a situation now where the productive capacity of the economy is simply not enough to fund the development priorities of government. You look at capital infrastructure. You also have recurrent expenditure commitments, right? The size of the federal. So we also have a situation where the size of governance, right, especially at the federal level, has also significantly increased. And you have a situation where, I know we're just talking about the National Assembly, lawmakers are continuing to tackle new agencies, new sort of regulatory priorities, and all of these require money in order to execute. And so we are sort of in this situation where, oil revenue, which is the primary means through which we still earn foreign exchange, even in the year of our Lord 2025, isn't keeping up with sort of our development priorities, and other aspects of the economy are simply, not productive enough, especially from a foreign currency revenue standpoint, right, to make up the shortfall. Therefore, we are in this situation where we have to borrow, right, and we've been borrowing exponentially, especially over the last this present administration, but certainly, under the last administration. Now, do we need $21.5 billion, right, in a budgetary year, essentially, to meet up that shortfall? That's very, very debatable, right, from my standpoint. The government itself projected that this year in 2025, it would need to borrow 16 trillion naira in order to make the 2025 budget work. We have now got into a situation where the federal, where the federal executive is asking for multiples of that amount, and the details as to how it is going to deploy those priorities, right, have not been made public. The letter to the National Assembly seems to be relatively thin on details in that respect, and so there is the obvious question that arises, which would be, where will a lot of these borrowings be be channeled. I know, for example, there were conversations earlier in the year around borrowing to, for example, conduct the national census. This is supposed to be a census year. But the government was looking at, I think, 100 billion naira or something just for that alone, right? So there are a lot of questions. We can have conversations around what the exact number should be, how it is going to impact, right, our financial commitments going forward, right, and the likes. But certainly the headline number of $21.5 billion is very eye-popping, even considering the fact that, we've been borrowing a lot more over the last 8 to 10 years. And, and questions are now being asked around the sustainability of our debt servicing and our debt commitments overall.
Right. I mean, you just alluded to a well-known fact that borrowing is not new. We have been doing a lot of borrowing. The concerns, again, would be where will these monies, what will they be allocated to? You've just talked about census. So the question is, how much of these funds will genuinely reach the key projects, and how much will be lost to mismanagement and corruption?
I think that's the most important question, right? If people were sure that a lot of these resources will be channeled towards the urgent developmental priorities that Nigeria has. You think health, you think education, you think just the provision of social services in general, you think infrastructure development. There are some big ticket infrastructure projects that this current administration has committed to and ostensibly is committed to delivering. Then maybe the argument for certainly a short-term increase in debt, in the overall debt pile, but just generally in our borrowing posture would be somewhat defensible. You also have a situation about how costly this will be going forward. I mean, right now, but going forward. So let's break that down a little bit. First and foremost, this is not the most advantageous time to be taking on new debt for many countries around the world, but especially for developing countries and countries with an economic profile like Nigeria. Because of the current global economic situation, right, investors are charging essentially more interest. They're requiring more interest in order to advance, right, credits to countries all over the world. Countries, right, are in premium that exists for practically every country out there when it comes to borrowing. So in relative terms, we'll be borrowing at relatively expensive rates. Now, the letter from the Federal Executive to the National Assembly does break down the fact that some of these borrowings will be fulfilled by domestic investors, and then some will be fulfilled by foreign investors. And I think there's a breakdown around different around borrowings in different currencies. So we'll be borrowing in USD, we'll be borrowing in pounds, we'll be borrowing in euros, we'll even be borrowing in Japanese yen apparently. So there's going to be a bit of a spread, and all of those will come at different interest rates. But the question still remains, whatever interest rates, right, will be provided, and maybe the debt management office will do some interest rate shopping to ensure that we borrow at as reasonable a rate as we can find. The overall level of interest rate borrowing will still be elevated and significant compared to what we've seen, right, in the last couple of years. That's the first part. The second part would be, we might have a situation, considering the sheer pile of debt that we want to take on at the same time, that at some point in the near to medium term future, we may need to refinance. And typically refinancing, it can occur at lower interest rates than when you initially borrowed, but the global economy, and especially Nigeria's economy, does not have the same carrying capacity as it does now. In the next 2 to 3 years, the net effect of that could be that debt, the overall debt file will be more expensive to service. And we've seen that with our debt servicing costs. In 2018, right, it cost us about 1.8 trillion naira, right, in debt interest alone, not in the total, in the total share of debt that we paid down. That's in 2018. By 2024, our debt servicing was 13 trillion naira, right? So there's a compounding interest to debt servicing and, making your interest rate payments, which it's fine and good if we're borrowing $20+ trillion now, but how much are we going to be paying year on year? It is, how much of the share of the national budget will that be, right, in every financial year going forward, right? We, in effect, over the last 4 years, have been borrowing a bit more in order to make up some of our previous debt and commitments, right? And so all of those things come together in a way where we need to ask ourselves the question as to, if we are borrowing now, are we going to channel these resources to the right development priorities to increase the productive capacity of the average Nigerian, such that with tax receipts, with exports, or with other forms of productive activity, the economy is generating enough revenue that we are able to pay back into the federal coffers, and then we are able to meet our debt commitments. The final point I will add is the fact that we have infrastructural projects and we have other sorts of development priorities to take care of now does not mean that we will not need to keep investing in Nigeria, in the Nigerian economy, right, in the future. So we also need to have a parallel conversation around where we will find the resources for future investments, right? Because if we continue along this current debt servicing and debt, accumulation and debt acquisition path, there's a real question as to whether Nigeria may be seen by investors as the kind of country where it is worth advancing credit to, if they are not going, or if there is the perception that we are not going to make our debt commitments in the future. So it's not just about borrowing today, but it's about how you service that debt, how you're servicing already existing debt, how you service these new debts that the federal government wants to tack on the national accounts, and what is the potential for us to take on new debt, right, and generate enough revenue to be able to sustain that debt in the future. So it's a really compounding conversation, and hopefully that conversation is a public conversation. It happens at the National Assembly. The spotlight continues, to be shown on our policymakers as they make that happen. But my hopes are really not up, considering the body language of this current set of legislators and lawmakers that seem to okay almost everything without a very serious debate.
Okay, seem to have a bit of a network.
As to where this lead Nigeria, from here on out.
All right. I mean, there are talks about, you've made mention of all of the key areas and key points why this borrowing could actually be impactful. And also, you mentioned we need to look inwards as well. We need to generate our own revenue as well to keep these taxes free and abated, in terms of not being hinged on every single Nigerian. I do recall that some months ago, especially during the Buhari administration, there were conversations regarding how much every single Nigerian is owing according to the debt ratio. But I wouldn't want to go into that. But my question is, we've looked at the aspect of the president borrowing. He's met with the assembly. What steps do you think the assembly should take, especially looking at experts who they may likely need to call in to look at the numbers, and then are able to debate, well, for the benefit of all Nigerians before approving this? Or do you think that it's not necessary? Because we've seen an assembly where people are afraid of that it could just be a rubber stamp assembly.
And where they're singing on your mandate, you should stand.
I mean, that's another one.
That's a great question, Joe. In terms of what they need to do, I think first and foremost, we need to receive testimony from the financial regulators who will actually be at the forefront of actually acquiring and this debt on behalf of the Nigerian people. So the Central Bank of Nigeria, the Debt Management Office, some of the development finance institutions, because we not only need to, part of the reason why the conversation around the debt has been
I'm afraid it seems we lost connection with Ikemesit there while he was trying to bring a clarity to that question. But let's see, hopefully, if we can reconnect and we can establish connection with him once more. Well, if we can't, I'm afraid it's a conversation that we might have to move further or forward and then take time
he's
to
answered
talk
the
about
critical questions.
Yeah, very key.
The only question that I believe is left is I mean, is it a do or die? Are there alternative measures or options?
And also to look at, because part of why they're borrowing is also for pensions. So looking at the pension crisis and how we can navigate this crisis, is this some sort of a temporary fix when we talk about the current pension crisis that we're experiencing? Or is this a long-lasting solution? Are we expecting that after this borrowing happens, there'll be a reoccurrence of the current position now?
And this is also going to be all uhuru for the current administration, because remember that in the past few weeks, while we've spoken to members of the current ruling party, they've also said that 2 years, in the next 2 years, we're going to see what the president would do. And I'm thinking possibly this could be the way, the road to actually ensure that you start fixing things. But I'm told Ikemesit is back. Ikemesit, if you're here, can you quickly touch on that question once again?
Yeah, okay, so I was saying that part of the issue that I personally have with the way the conversation around the national debt has historically been had is that it has been siloed from wider questions of national development and what national development priority should be, right? So oftentimes there are two parallel conversations that go on, right? CBN, the debt management office, would oftentimes be at the leading edge of saying, okay, we need to borrow X amount of money, or they would make announcements that we have in fact borrowed that amount of money at so and so interest rates, and it will be channeled to so and so priority. But there often isn't clear follow through, or if there is, it's not apparent to the general public. The National Assembly, for example, has committees that are saddled with oversight responsibilities for these agencies, but just generally for Nigeria's fiscal situation, as it were. I would like to see some of those committee hearings become more public. I would like to see the media, for example, be allowed to attend a lot more of those, hearings, so that the Nigerian people can have a general, continuously updated picture around, all these monies, right? Which in their name, Joe, the amount of money that the average Nigerian is on tap for, right, per person. And I think budget projects that number is going to rise up to 625,000 naira per person by the end of this year. And this is without this new borrowing request. So we need to have, a serious conversation around what exactly we're borrowing for. Can borrowing be tied to specific developmental priorities? So can we borrow specifically, or can bonds be raised specifically to invest in education? Like, in my opinion, primary and secondary education, like primarily, should we be looking at borrowing that is just ring-fenced to capital infrastructure provision? If you have a situation where you're borrowing because you're owning salaries, you need to pay salaries, then we are not going to get on a sustainable financial and fiscal path. This conversation also has to be tethered to wider conversations around fiscal sustainability. So we've been having, discussions, for example, around the size of governance and whether, the federal government needs to be this big. The federal government, after agriculture, is the single biggest employer of the most number of Nigerians. While that is often the case for many countries, does it need to be this big for a country, right, of our economic size, for example? There are folks who would argue, and I think I'll count myself in that camp, would say there are many people who appear to be loafing within the federal governance system, that we could do a lot better if we streamline agencies, if we rationalize agencies. We have a 2014 report, the Oronsoye report, which has not been faithfully executed on by, this is the third administration now since that report was published. That's probably a good place, a good starting point to go back and say, how many federal agencies do we need? How much are we spending on those agencies? we always get to a situation in December and January where reports come out about, some interesting budgeting item that a particular federal agency, maybe it's 1 or 2 billion for tissue paper or 3 billion for transport or stuff like that. That makes you really question whether we're spending the little resources we have in the most optimal way possible. So pairing the conversation around debt to wider conversations around the structure of our economy, what sort of economy we want to have, what sort of values, what sort of projections, what sort of priorities we want to fund over a 5 to 10 year horizon, and then channeling those resources and prosecuting those who participate in resource leakage or corruption, as it were. All of this is a holistic conversation that needs to happen. A lot of our policymakers like to separate and pass out those priorities. But in the end, what are we borrowing for? Where do these borrowings go to? And why have we put ourselves in a situation where we need to borrow as much? This is the second full year of this administration. And now we've come to a situation where for the second year running, we need supplementary borrowing, right? In order to make the national accounts work. That should indicate to us that we can't keep going on like this, and we need to chart a better path forward.
Ikemesit Effiong, thank you for joining us this morning to dissect exactly what the concerns of Nigerians are and the expectations regarding this intended borrowing. We'll keep up with the latest updates as we proceed on that story. Thank you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.